AI is transforming applications, but with innovation comes new risks. Enter Noma, the first application security platform built to secure the entire data and AI lifecycle. From your AI supply chain to models and runtime, Noma protects it all. With a single platform that integrates seamlessly across your data pipelines, Jupyter Notebooks, ML Ops tools, code, and application SDKs, Noma delivers full lifecycle visibility, security, and compliance. Start securing your data and AI lifecycle at securityweekly.com/Noma. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Greg Anderson about Defect Dojo and crafting a culture of delivering value from AppSec tools. I'm your host, trying to deliver some value, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Kalyani Pawar, also delivering some podcast value. One quick announcement. Do you want to shape the future of identity? Of course you do. Identiverse 2025 is looking for dynamic speakers like you to share groundbreaking ideas with over 3,000 identity and access management leaders. Join the most influential voices in IAM and help drive innovation in our industry. Submit your presentation proposal today at securityweekly.com/IDVCFP. John Kalyani, it is a year, it's 2025. I've still remembered to say that. A year of new news in AppSec, and maybe we will probably prognosticate a little bit. I suppose we're going to have to talk about something SQL injection, something cross-site scripting, something more than something about LLMs, more maybe something about crypto, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about something new and different. But at least that's my hope for the year. But speaking of hopes for the year, I'm going to kind of dash them with a dip into the past with an article on not clickjacking, but double clickjacking. So here's an article, Double Clickjacking, a new era of UI redressing. And clickjacking just kind of disappeared for a while until off everybody's radar, wasn't showing up on bug bounty reports, scanner, blah, 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 until now double clickjacking, the gist of which is that the attack technique has been slightly refined into essentially a mouse down and a mouse up, but separating the timing of those two actions across a few milliseconds so that an attacker can swap out what the location URL is, so that on the mouse up, that event fires on whatever that clickjacking target of the attacker's choice was meant to be. And they talk about some examples of using this, for example, doing OAuth grants so that you can do account takeovers by tricking the person into double clickjacking a OAuth grant and taking over their account. This was interesting, fun. At least I think it was interesting. We'll see what Kalyani and John think. But it sort of spoke to me of, are we reinventing all of the AppSec vulnerabilities of the past? Do we have nothing new to talk about? This is what worries me. Kalyani, what were you starting to think of when you saw double clickjacking?
From double, I was thinking to no clickjacking. Like, how about that? It's like, I'm now expecting double SQL injections and double CSRFs and all sorts of doubles now. It's like duplicating my fears.
The question that crosses my mind is, I don't know about you guys. I'm trying to think of examples. Was clickjacking ever really a big thing outside of like people reporting it on AppSec reports? I mean, I don't think I ever really heard a lot of like that going on in the wild.
And that's a great point to bring up. And part of the reason I did want to pull this in, because clickjacking to me always did feel similar to CSRF. That idea that AppSec industry, AppSec community was like, oh, look at this really cool new attack. Here is a DEF CON presentation about it. Here's a Black Hat presentation. Here's another slew of OWASP presentations about really cool ways to pull off this attack technique. But it was, I won't necessarily say fully contrived examples. They could be consequential, but it didn't feel like they were the most important things to draw attention to, that they were the most impactful. And in both cases, what was really awesome and I think successful is that the browser vendors largely figured out with same-site cookies, with some X-frame options headers, ways of essentially eradicating this type of vulnerability rather than requiring every single website out there to go do some very specific reconfiguration change, something that's just not sustainable, not scalable. So on the one hand, I do feel, and we'll see what our listeners think about this, I do feel like it was overblown in the sense of impact and consequence, because AppSec was just loved to talk about it because it was finally something new and different that wasn't cross-site scripting, but it was also successfully defended against from the browser vendors. So that's where my mind went in reading this, John. So it was, I guess, double plus good to invoke my 1984 in the sense of how browser vendors dealt with this. But that's a long pause to also, let's dip back into some tools. And every news segment, I try to find a little bit of a theme, and the themes tend to be like, this is about parsing, and it's a couple different CVEs about parsing, or here's a different theme about how things tie together. This year, I'm starting off with two different tools, both related to HTTP. One is curl is dropping hyper. So throughout 2024, CISA and admittedly the Application Security Weekly podcast was talking about memory safety quite a bit. We had many articles talking about the migration of C code bases to a Rust implementation, sponsored by Prosimo and the memorysafety.org, or that group, rewriting things like TLS, DNS, NTP, a couple other core things that just aren't very exciting but are kind of consequential to the internet. Curl, for 4 years, was working on a hyper backend, bringing this into a new backend to curl. It's a Rust implementation of HTTP 1. They got 95% of the way and then said, you know what? We're just going to stop, because that last 5% was both too hard and a bit of a callback to our conversation with Greg. No one was really asking for it other than kind of like AppSec folks. Like, you should do this just for the sake of doing this. And that doesn't seem like the healthy way for AppSec to be approaching any type of project. And I see both Kalyani and John nodding and agreed with my words that I'm saying here. But I'm not sure, Kalyani, is there something else you would add to that feeling of, oh, just implement this because AppSec said so?
I think it's just like the culture problem that, all of us are facing. It's just like, I'm trying so hard to move the needle with respect to like changing the culture around security. And usually it's the tools that help me do it. But now it's just like we didn't maybe need this tool at all. So it just makes a harder case for, I want to change culture around security. But yeah, what about you, John?
I think there's two aspects to it here, right? One is, as we were talking before about budgets, we as sort of security practitioners have to be sort of, I think, a little more careful and strategic around where do we want people to make these changes? Do we want to go Rust, and like have everyone rewrite everything in there? And, my thoughts on that. Or, when do we go for those more targeted, saying, hey, back to the previous example, it's like, here's just use this one library and you'll get rid of double clickjacking. And it feels like it was interesting to me that the point in the article where he says, hey, we got 95% there. It's a lot of work, man. I actually can't believe there's been 4 years, but okay, we've done that. We had the academic experience. What are we doing? Or if it's not being used, then yeah, it's unfortunate that they didn't just stop and leave it there, but they actually pulled it. I think that's a little sad, but yeah, it's good try. What's next?
Good try. What's next? Yeah, in February 2025, it will that hyper backend will disappear officially from curl, And as we like to joke, I love the refactoring, rewriting, but that's because I'm not thinking about this from a business perspective. About the business has to make money, and that's another callback to our conversation with Greg. And John, you did pull in an article about compiling C to safe Rust, formalized, which maybe would be a help here, but maybe that's still a misdirected effort. How should we interpret this?
So this is still. I mean, it's a preprint on Xarchive, or on Archive. Sorry. So where it sort of tickled me was the idea of, hey, two researchers said, let's come up with a minimized version of the C language, or a less featureful. And the reason what's going on here is, if you look at some of there's people out there right now that are creating programs that will automatically convert your C code into, or C++ into Rust. The problem is that can't be one-to-one translation, right? A lot of the memory work and pointer work and things like that, you can't port over to Rust. So some people are getting around by doing ugly things like, allowing unsafe in the code or things like that. And what these guys have decided to do is, like, if we can come up with a version of C, which is, we know it's a safer, cleaner place to be with in the beginning, then when we do that automatic translation to Rust, we're going to have more faith in better safety in the resulting code. And they're now able to do that. What they're doing with this in here is formal verification of that path across. So it seems like to me, it's interesting from a point of view of, if you're going to go and convert a bunch of C code, or have your team do it, or what have you, for the reason, or the alleged reason of security, if we can sort of ensure that, yeah, that's actually going to be a good translation. We know what's going on. We're using tools which have been tested. It calls to me. I haven't touched this in real life yet, so I'm not sure what it actually is like to use, but I really like the idea of what they're trying to do there.
To me, I also like the idea of just transpiling from one language into another, in the sense of using LLVM. The V, very important in there. This is not an LLM usage. But the other part is, I do wonder, formal verification has come across my radar, mostly just related to TLS stacks. And I wondered now, I'm going to steal your phrase, John, the mathy math of formal verification. Will we start to see that in more of protocol designs, protocol implementations beyond just TLS? Because that is a way to help to say, was this RFC, was this protocol spec well defined? Are there ambiguous areas? Is the implementation flawed? And that is, I think, going to be more helpful for us as an AppSec to say, we've actually can demonstrate we have better security in this library now. So that's my hope to see in 2025. Where are the math nerds out there doing some formal verification?
My sense is, I think most of the large companies have formal verification teams. I can't say that phrase, but I think what we're going to start seeing is it's going to start being driven by customer demand, is my guess. We've seen enough of these sort of, I'll say, talks or published papers around what some of the companies are doing, that I think people are starting to go, oh, that's a thing that we could ask for, or that's a thing which exists. I'm really worried about my, I don't know, I'll say security group or firewall rules. Is there some way that they can do formal verification around that? That would give me a lot more trust to use it. So I suspect it's going to sort of grow that way.
I suspect we will still have problems with using libraries correctly. And here's an article I pulled out from Liren Tal. He has a Node.js newsletter. He was a fun guest we had on back in 2024, and it was about how to avoid JWT security mistakes in Node.js, which basically boiled down to, you can decode a JWT. You can also verify a JWT, and you kind of need to verify the signature is correct, which goes a little bit beyond that. Can be formally implemented and designed, but the API still has to have, my question there is sort of, should we have a decode and a verify, or should decode just automatically decode and verify and throw an error, or do something else to say, here is just, this signature is bad. And this is a little bit related to an article that Kalyani you pulled out about a nuclei flaw. This malicious templates bypass signature verification. And so we both had our mind on signatures to start things off in 2025. What were you thinking when you read that particular article?
I was thinking about parser and the ghosts of parsers. It's basically, it's talking about like a YAML parser gone wrong. And that helps someone bypass and run things on like a local system. Can you imagine the impact of parsers? You think like it's something really small. It's like something I could just spin up with ChatGPT, a simple regex or something like that. But the impact being so huge that it can bypass signature verification, I think that absolutely blows my mind.
Yeah, and that's a great tie-in for, I pulled in another article about finding critical flaws in secure systems. This is from Trail of Bits, once again, one of my go-to sources for really fun articles. And they're talking about parsing, but more about the focus on recursion. And one of the things I did want to highlight here right off the bat, once again, a good callback to our conversation with Greg, is that, to quote from the article, Stack overflows as a result of these types of recursion flaws or recursion attacks typically result in little or no real-world harm in most contexts. And I wanted to throw that caveat in there because I've seen, for example, a lot of CVEs related to like regex-based DOSes. Like you can blow up a regular expression because it's poorly anchored, or its globbing is overly greedy. And so, yes, legitimately, they could be attacked. They could do a lot of resource consumption, like CPU resource consumption on them. But in the real world, it's just blah. I don't know what word to use there, as you can tell, as I'm vomiting practically into my microphone, just to be like, that's nice, but that's kind of a quality issue. But this isn't something where we need to take up everybody's time, and this is a flaw that has to be fixed within 6 days that we're tracking in our Jira ticket, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I did want to get that off of my chest, but I do like the write-up about just really from Trail of Bits focusing on when are you using parsing? Because one of my at the end of last year was parsing was on my mind, and there's a lot of really interesting things here around parsing. They're pointing out to protobuf and other things that are just language agnostic about problems that these types of parsers can run into. So I'm not sure where I'm going there, other than I want to try and use parsing as a stepping stone to bring in more conversations and richer conversations about secure design and defaults, the idea of algorithm design. Let's have a depth counter, which they call out as a very good countermeasure to these types of problems. So that's where my mind is going. So Kalyani, John, and our listeners know as I start to pull in more articles throughout the year. And I don't know, Lissy, did that particularly excite you as much as it does me, as talking about parsers? Am I alone here? Oh, I hear that laughing. This isn't good.
I'm laughing with you, not at you.
I'm not sure.
No. What was interesting about this is I think you hit pretty close there when you said it. Think about from the design point of view, and it sort of makes me think. Recursion is one of those things which were taught in CS classes and like, oh, wow, cool, we can do this, right? Or maybe like a interview question, like, write a recursive, blah, 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 search. Yeah. But at least to me professionally, when I'm writing professional code, that's one of those things you use only with, to me, it's I only want to see recursion around if I've really thought it through, really thought how's this working, and yeah, don't let it be unbounded. It feels like it is one of those categories of things. I'll say I'm scared of. I'm not scared of it, but it's something you give a significant amount of respect. I'll say, and I think that. You can probably say that for more aspects of parsers as well, but I don't know, Kalyan, if that sort of would you when you're talking to startups or different people out there, if someone starts saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about using recursion," does that get a reaction out of you, or?
Well, talking broadly about parsers, I don't think there's a lot of awareness around parsers, especially when it's like, if I could just take a step back, it's like starting to define what secure coding looks like, and then we are very far off from having a conversation about parsers, because right now we're talking about do not use hard-coded secrets. These are some issues with JWT. We're there right now. Just defining the nascent secure coding checklist, and it in reference to like defining what a secure library is. Not everybody is super aware about it, and we're just starting to define or educate and train what a secure library is. That's more so anything I feel about parsers, very, very far from them, but also very intrigued by them at the same time.
Yeah, and I think to your point, that one of the reasons they've been coming on my mind is that parsers can be working on either call it user supplied input or untrusted input. And we have things like the billion laugh attacks, old XML type of example where the parsing can just explode in a really fun way. You can have 10 lines of XML just take up gigs and gigs of memory that kills a CPU. And that to me is a thing of wonder and style from an attacker's perspective. That's really cool. And it does introduce the idea of here's a parser. That's where I would nudge people towards, if you're writing a parser from scratch, do start that with Rust, a memory safe language, because there's a lot of easy ways to go off of miscalculate lengths, go do boundary conditions of just what you're bringing in, let alone just getting into the recursion aspect of it. So it does feel to me one of those more fruitful areas to talk by example about a threat modeling or about secure coding principles, rather than make up here's a cross-site scripting example that we shouldn't even be using as an example, because just go and use something like React. It's a solved problem. So that's where my mind goes in sort of the pedagogical aspect, if you will. There is another aspect. We'll come back to parsers, but I did want to hit on, since we are talking about libraries, talking about writing code, Cloudflare has their own command line tool called h3i, which is a command line tool for dealing with low-level HTTP 3 testing. And the low-level part is pretty important. I wanted to emphasize that because as they call out in their write-up for this, is that there are things like HTTP2 use the Python requests library. There are other libraries for HTTP 3. But in HTTP2 world, there was the rapid reset attack. And so you have smart people out there like Portswigger, Gareth, and company looking for those weird edges of the RFC, of the protocol spec, to see what are people not using, or what's in the RFC that got implemented but just aren't quite standard, that tend to collect dust, or probably have implementation mismatches across different libraries. And that's where the flaws come out of. And what Cloudflare is pointing out here is that libraries do want to try to be defensive in the sense of making it easier for developers to not make mistakes. But that works a little bit against security testing, because you want to be able to nudge and play with a lot of these weird edge cases of frames, weird situations, weird states that you can set things like HTTP 3 into, just to see what happens. Does this remote stack I'm interacting with handle that well? And so h3i feels like one of those really fun tools from an AppSec perspective to be able to go through and start playing around with some protocols. So that got me excited. So I'm going to be playing with some more command line tools in 2025, I think is my takeaway from this particular article.
I'm trying to. It's sort of funny for me on this one. I like the idea of the tool, but what I'm struggling with is, would I want a CLI tool that does this, or would I just want a library that I could link into some code that I'm playing with? I'm trying to figure out in my head which way, if there's a benefit one over the other. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, because I think if I'm understanding, it's more of what are the best ways then to set up my test cases, my test suite, to be able to interact. I'll say perhaps this way, is h3i a drop-in now for a fuzzer? Can I just give this to a fuzzer, and the fuzzer can say, yep, I now know how to interact with an HTTP 3 stack. I'm going to start doing all these weird things and then find something fun and a vulnerability that can or can't be exploited. Who knows? But it's a flaw, and that's one of the reasons I love fuzzers. So John set me up for being able to mention fuzzers as if one of my favorite flaw finding tools to be alliterative. But Kalyani, we're going to jump around a little bit here. Speaking of double clickjacking, double SQL injection, double cross-site scripting, you had an article that took us in a very different direction. Tell us about the hackers weaponize Visual Studio Code remote tunnels for cyber espionage, which sounds very ominous.
Yeah, it is dystopian. Yeah, speaking about like VS Code, I know like there's so many developers out there who use VS Code as like a legitimate tool. Thinking about legitimate tool, that just increases the attack surface, right? And then the article basically talks about SQL injection on different internet-facing applications and database servers using SQL Map. And it's also in combination with Mimikatz. It's been a whole minute since I read about Mimikatz. So they made like their own version of Mimikatz called MimiCN or something like that. And then they've coupled this together to steal information from VS Code, which, I mean, isn't that like, what? And yeah, there's traces linking it to cyber espionage. Yeah. And so I think it brings me to a point of what do I trust and not trust? Yeah.
Yeah, it does feel like, wait, was this article from 2015 or 2025? Just, as you're rattling off those names, SQL injection, SQL map, etc. Yeah. But so yes, what is old is new again. Sorry, that'll be my last cliche of the segment. But it does point out that for as many solved problems as AppSec figures out, the distribution of that solution seems to be far too slow. And I think to your point too, supply chain is going to be one of those things that is one of those pillars of AppSec that we're going to be talking about throughout the year. So we'll see what kind of flavor supply chain takes in 2025, see if it's new and different. But in terms of other things that we'll have to be talking about, I say with a not so small sigh throughout 2025, generative AI and LLMs. So this was an article from December 31st, 2024. So this was probably the last jailbreaking technique published in 2024 about the bad Likert judge, a novel multi-turn technique to jailbreak LLMs by misusing their evaluation capability, which really just boils down to prompting an LLM to say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 5, tell me how to build it. Tell me the ways that I shouldn't build a bomb. Tell me the ways that I should build a bomb. And so they're really pointing out this is kind of an edge case of way of refining attacks against an LLM to jailbreak them. And as they describe, jailbreaking in this sense, getting out of the trust and safety, getting out of the guardrails about what the LLM is ostensibly supposed to be focused on. And I think, so I don't want to, jailbreaking prompt injection, they do feel like the cross-site scripting of the ages. They're just kind of really fun, like code golf, if you will, just kind of fun techniques, but they're not too exciting in general. But I will draw attention to, near the end of it, about content filtering as a countermeasure to this, which does, as they're pointing out, does still seem to be a rather general countermeasure to these types of attacks. So using content filtering, that you have a classification model that I'm mostly quoting from the article now on both the prompt, basically what the attacker or what the user submitted to the LLM, as well as what was the output of it. And if those two match, that this output matches a non-harmful content, or this input was probably asking for non-harmful input, that content filter says, okay, let's carry on. And I think the only other thing that was curious about this, and then I'll turn it back over to my esteemed co-host, is that when the researchers were looking at this, this technique increased their attack success rate by at least 60%. But what was interesting, it was mostly the increases were across attacks focused on harassment, or along that, or generating harmful content of that nature, which just seemed to point out these are areas where LLMs are going to struggle because they can be, call it more contextual. They actually need human brain. They need actual human reasoning to understand this is harmful, this is harassing, versus here was that non-deterministic probabilistic string of tokens that the LLM strung together. And that was a lot of words that I just strung together. Kalyani, I don't know if you followed along or if there's something else that you hope to see in 2025 about Gen AI, LLMs, and application security.
I can answer what I hope not to see.
Okay. Oh, even better.
I hope not to see simple alert script for CSRF being entered into LLM and then it being executed. I hope not to see a reflected XSS on a simple LLM prompt. These are just few things I hope not to see going forward.
Challenge accepted. Readers, if you could find those, send us examples. And we'll
there was a recent example from Johan. I hope I don't butcher his last name, so I'm not going to say it, but I'll try to link it in my articles. But it was a very simple, basic XSS attack on an LLM. And I was like,
sigh. Long sigh. All right, John. Yeah, we've turned this into what do you not want to see with LLMs in 2025? And you can't just say LLMs because that's too easy.
I'll put a positive spin on it. Actually, what I liked in this article was the towards the end they sort of measure and graph the effectiveness of these attacks across different models. And I think what I'd like to see is a little more of that type of actual like science-based, I'll say reporting, but like, yeah, show us, don't just, if you're working on something interesting like this, obviously you have to get further along in your research, but then like, yeah, run it across a few different things and like, when is it more effective or less effective? Or as you were saying, is there certain areas, it's really interesting that there, at least to me, that there's not as much guardrails around, say, harassment versus how to make a bomb. I get it. I understand why. But still, that's an interesting trade-off that someone made, right? Yeah, I don't want the basic things. I know we'll cover jailbreaks again, but I'm hoping for more meaty research, I'll say.
Yeah, and I'll riff off that to say the more quantified research perhaps is another way of putting what you're saying, as well as quantified value of what AppSec is delivering in terms of, are we rewriting this into Rust because we just wanted to do it, or we're solving a problem, or we're actually doing something that developers are asking for, or if they're not asking for it, they're realizing that they're benefiting now that they should have asked for it. And realizing benefit is one of those things. But Kalyani, why don't you take us out? What are the last thoughts for the first news segment of 2025?
I'm very hopeful. That's my last thought for today. I'm hopeful that we might say that who needs this tool, but I also am hopeful that I'm going to be able to modify the culture and move it in a positive direction and find tools that are going to complement secure development. These are my closing thoughts for the first episode.
That's wonderful. Kalyani is hopeful. John is putting a positive spin on things. 2025 is going to be a weird year. But I want to say Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much to Kalyani and John for making all of these segments very fun. Please do, as always, remember to subscribe, share us on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of a new year, check out some new music of Night Drive by Turbo Night. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.